Do you want me to put up my screen?
Yes, please.
Let's make sure that. Damn. See, this is what happens.
We'll change that to the slide mode.
Okay, there we are.
Okay, that's great. That's great, Ian. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's our great privilege to have Professor Ian Morgan to give the SERI name lecture, the Professor Chew Sik Jin Distinguished Lecture. Professor Chew was the founding director of the Singapore Eye Research Institute, and he was a pioneer in myopia. He was a very good friend of Professor Ian Morgan and my mentor, but unfortunately he passed away several years ago. Professor Ian Morgan needs no introduction. He is the foremost world expert on environmental factors for myopia. Professor Ian Morgan is a visiting fellow at the Australian National University, the ANU in Canberra, and the Zhongshan Ophthalmic Center in Guangzhou, China, where he spent a few years working with many Chinese eye hospitals and the Chinese government on stemming myopia in China. He's also visited Singapore many times and given several talks, and he has been a collaborator on many of our grants. Professor Ian Morgan has a basic degree in biochemistry and pharmacology and a PhD in neuroscience. He started his work on animal models of myopia and then on the epidemiology of myopia as aware of the epidemic in East Asia. He's a proponent of environmental factors for myopia, and he's going to talk about the role of education and, of course, the role of outdoor time, which Professor Ian Morgan has been advocating for some time as well. So let's hear from Professor Ian Morgan. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Seang, for that kind introduction. What I'm going to talk about today is myopia, a disease that's caused by schooling and which needs to be treated through changes to schooling. I do have to declare one conflict of interest, travel support from iRising International, but I don't think it's relevant to today's topic. As Seang said, I've had a long relationship with people in Singapore, including Chu Sek Jin. He was obviously a very brilliant man with a big vision. And from the perspective of this talk, it is important that he recognised the emergence of an epidemic of myopia in Singapore. And there was a seminal paper in the Singapore Medical Journal in 1988. He was, I've got deputy director. It was actually from what Seang said, director of the Singapore Eye Research Institute. And basically his influence triggered a whole lot of studies. Seang storm study, the studies on the use of atropine to control the progression of myopia. He recognised that myopia was in part a biological problem, and that's where I came into the field. And this led to him working with Josh Wallman in New York. He established a tradition of international networking that has seen Singapore, SERI, and SNEC become world leaders in the field of myopia, as well as in other eye diseases. But most importantly for this talk, he recognised the crucial role of education in generating myopia. If you go back and look at that seminal paper, you can see this in 1988. This is really the key element here, the dependence of ametropia, for this purpose, myopia, on educational level. And you can see with no formal education or only primary education, very little myopia, tertiary educated, up to 60%. Now, this was a study carried out on conscripts born in 1954 to 1964, and Singapore was a very different place in those days. You can see this reflected here. Roughly 10% had no education. Over 30% had only primary school education. Very different picture. But nevertheless, you could see the increasing prevalence with educational level. He also recognised something very important that's still not sufficiently recognised today. The educational level also affected the prevalence of high myopia with enough education. And you can see here there's very little myopia, high myopia at a constant level across lower levels of education, but in the tertiary educated, the increase in high myopia. You'll still read many papers today that say high myopia is genetic, but in reality, even in those early days, many high myopes were only highly myopic because of environmental exposures. Now, not everybody agrees with this view that education is fundamentally important. And I quite honestly don't know what Seang Jin would believe today. There's a recent paper from the World Health Organization, International Telecommunications Union, Myopia Ed program. And it's very interesting because they say things like, the messages aim to avoid people misinterpreting them as anti-education. Rather, the focus should be on encouraging more time outdoors during leisure time. Don't touch the schools. Again, rather the focus should be on encouraging changes in behaviour during leisure time. Don't touch the schools. Now, they're certainly right in the sense that opposing education is not an option, but arguing that education needs to be reformed to minimise myopia is not anti-education, it's for better education. Now, there's no doubt that myopia develops in association with schooling. The prevalence of myopia increases in higher grades all over the world as long as children go to school. I've just pulled some data from a paper Seang and I published several years ago now from the SCORM study showing that there is a strong association between academic performance within a grade level and the development of myopia. Higher performance, more myopia. Now, a test of a hypothesis that education is a major determinant of myopia comes when it can explain rather bizarre observations. And one that's always taken my fancy is the epidemic of myopia that's appeared in Jewish ultra-Orthodox boys in Israel. If you compare this figure, which is the prevalence, the distribution of myopia in young adults in China, with that in Jewish ultra-Orthodox boys, you can see it's very similar and it overlaps with the range of high myopia, confirming Seang Jin's insight. What's really interesting about the Israeli example is the boys are myopic and the girls are not. And the reason for this is quite clearly because the boys have intense education from the age of 3 in studying the Jewish religious text, the Torah, and the girls get a general education and they're no more myopic than the general population. It's hard to think of any other explanation for that in the context of what we know about myopia. Now, nevertheless, people have asked, is the association between myopia and education causal? and we know causality is an absolutely crucial thing to establish. The argument was general who are more prone to myopia for genetic reasons might be more likely to favour educational pathways because near work was easier. That seems very unlikely to me in the case of the Orthodox Jews in Israel. Boys fundamentally genetically different to girls in terms of myopia? I think that's highly unlikely. Nevertheless, a number of people have now published papers using Mendelian randomization or regression discontinuity analysis to show that the relationship, the association is actually a causal one. I thought the evidence was so strong that at the time I said to Jez Guggenheim, well, look, I'm glad you got the right result, because if you'd got a different result, I would have had to ask what was wrong with Mendelian randomization. But fortunately, it all worked out. Now, I just want to show you one piece of data coming out of the Guangzhou twin eye study that we put together with Ding Xiaohu. And it makes use of enrolment date to examine what is causing myopia. Is it educational exposure or is it simply increasing age? Enrolment rules mean that within one grade, you will have an age range of about a year. With the way we looked at it, we can actually get an average age range of 8 months. By contrast, if you're comparing not within a grade, but between grades, you can get, in our analysis, a 4-month age difference. Within a grade, there's virtually no difference in mean spherical equivalent between the oldest and the youngest in a class. But between the youngest in a higher grade and the oldest in a lower grade, there is a very big difference. And this shows that it's the additional educational exposure that children have had in a higher grade which makes them more myopic. Now, there's a quite fundamental insight that comes out of this, and that is that children who do not go to school do not become myopic. And indeed, a lot of epidemiological evidence supports this idea. We drew up a graph to try and show how the prevalence of myopia was related to education, where there's little or no formal education. The prevalence of myopia is generally 1 to, at the most, 5%. When you get to modern Western education, where people are completing 12 years of school, it gets to about 20% in the final year. You compare that to the modern East Asian situation, and in East Asia, I'm including Singapore, although it's formerly, I think, part of Southeast Asia, it's up to 80%. You can see a gradual increase historically from this position to the modern Western situation, and then there is this big jump to outcomes in East Asia, and the question is why? Now, one of the things to note is that you do get an association between high prevalence of myopia in East Asian jurisdictions and high educational outcomes. And this can be very easily seen by looking at the PISA international surveys of school outcomes. I've marked in red the countries which are known to have a high prevalence of myopia. I've marked in yellow countries where we suspect, sometimes with good data, but more often with not very good data, that the prevalence is a lot lower. You can see how the red countries are clustered together at the top of the distribution. And remember there's another 80 countries that I haven't listed here which have even lower prevalences of myopia. The clustering does appear to be more marked with mathematics and science than with reading. I don't think that means that mathematics makes you myopic. I think it's the way in which mathematics is taught that might be important. When Kathy Rose and I looked at this back in 2013, we suggested that the root cause of this was that the East Asian education systems were based on competitive school pathways involving key schools, advanced classes, and very significant branch points, high-stakes examination where children were directed into certain pathways. And this led to the early onset of educational pressure, such as homework, to get your preschoolers into the right primary school. It also led to the extensive use of private supplementary tutorial classes, and sometimes from an early age. And there were differences in time outdoors. Now, I just want to stress how strong the differences in preschool are. And I think you all know about the preschools in Singapore, but I pulled out two pieces which describe the different approaches. In Singapore, activities include learning language, written and oral, numbers, development of personal and social skills, games, music, and outdoor play, plus learning two languages. In Sydney, and this is the official Australian government statement about preschool, learning through play, play-based approach, play as an activity, not a mention of a formal educational outcome. That starts in primary school. Now, this is really important. The early childhood educators tell us in particular that one of the things that happens with play-based learning is you develop resilience. And I know that that's been a bit of a buzzword around educational policy in Singapore: more outdoor play, more resilience. Now, I just want to take you very briefly through the evidence that time outdoors can be used to limit the onset of myopia. A clear study showed that increased time outdoors, or playing sports as they called it, could overcome the influence of parental myopia. In the Sydney Myopia study, we showed that time outdoors could overcome high levels of near work. We followed this up with Seang in a comparison of Chinese children growing up in Sydney and Singapore. It's a very striking difference in prevalence: Sydney 3.3%, Singapore 29.1%. And the only risk factor that seemed capable of explaining this big difference was a much greater time spent outdoors by children of Chinese ethnicity in Sydney as compared to in Singapore. It's important to note that the prevalence of myopia was even lower in the children of Caucasian origin growing up in Sydney, around about 1%, and they had correspondingly more time outdoors. Very rapidly, this was turned into school-based trials, and increased time outdoors slowed the onset of myopia. Pei-Chung Wu showed this in Guangzhou in 2013. Around 80 minutes a day, a 50% reduction. Around 40 minutes a day, a 23% reduction was what we found in Guangzhou. Looks almost like a dose-response curve. Since then, there's been further large-scale implementation in Taiwan, and I'd refer you particularly to the Yilan Myopia and Vision Improvement Program. It shows that there has been a roughly 50% reduction in preschool pre-myopia and myopia in Yilan County, and this result has been maintained over 7 years, including during the COVID pandemic. I think there are two questions about time outdoors. How do we most effectively implement it? And do we need more than 2 hours per day? Now, a couple of years ago, a Wantang primary school in China made headlines in China Daily because amongst its pupils there was no myopia. This once 50 years ago used to be common in China, but it's very, very rare indeed now. The school had two characteristics. One, it was a rural school, so you would expect a little bit less myopia, but it was a 5-day boarding school which had a policy of 3 hours per day outdoors. And this meant for 5 days a week at least, children had 3 days outdoors, and the end result was no myopia. So I think we need to think about pushing the upper limit of time outdoors more towards 3 hours than settling for 2. Now, one of the important results that came out of the Singapore SCORM study, and that has been since replicated by others, is that if you follow the trajectory of development of myopia, you discover that the age of onset effectively determines the final refractive state. A lot of people thought, well, if you delayed the onset of myopia by a year, it would simply speed up and you'd get to the same point. But this suggests very strongly that a delay in onset will mean less progression by perhaps a diopter. If you compare these two, maybe as much as 2 diopters. So delay in onset induced by time outdoors will mean less progression and less high myopia. Now, I'm not going to through the methods for slowing progression clinically. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, and I'm not an expert in them. But they are now available, and they're a necessary complement to prevention. The one remark I'll make about them is that we really don't know how they work. We don't really know this for orthokeratology, although there are some good ideas. For atropine, we really don't have very much idea. And for these sorts of technologies that depend on defocus, the design principles are being questioned as to whether they are actually the mode of action. So a big mystery all round. Now, the important thing about these approaches is, can they be applied to pre-myopes as well as myopes? And to answer that question, I just need to say something about what pre-myopia is. The International Myopia Institute has defined it as a range of refractions from plus 0.75 diopter to minus 0.5 diopter, where a combination of risk factors makes it likely that future myopia will develop. Now, it's important to note that this is not very different to the normal definition of emetropia of plus 0.5 diopter to greater than minus 0.5 diopter. Now, refractive development has generally been described as a process of emetropization, where the endpoint with cycloplegia is 0 diopter, and that there's a mechanism for maintaining emetropia once it's activated, once it's achieved. But I've been arguing for some years that the endpoint isn't 0 diopter. It's about plus 1 diopter, and there is actually no mechanism for maintaining emetropia. I favour a three-stage model of refractive development, creating initially what I would call a hyperopic reserve. It's an old term used in the literature, of +1 diopter and slightly above it is the desired endpoint of refractive development. When environmental pressures become too long, you start to move down towards the pre-myopia range. There does appear to be a mechanism for maintaining the hyperopic reserve, but it's relatively weak compared to the environmental pressures that are now about. And so children are pushed from hyperopic reserve into pre-myopia. And once they get into that state, further progression to myopia is almost inevitable and only halted by children getting older and refractive plasticity declining. Now, one of the pieces of evidence we use to argue from that is that, in fact, when you look at how refraction develops, emmetropia is always a minor category. It's almost as though children go through from hyperopia into emmetropia and on to myopia, almost in balance. We've now adjusted one of the graphs we used earlier to look at this category of pre-myopia. And it's a very transient category in younger children, with rates of myopia progression that are typical of China or indeed Singapore at age 7. Children will pass through the pre-myopia stage in just a bit over a year. Whereas at age 15, they can remain in that state because progression is so much slower for around 4 years. Now, it's important to note at a practical level, if we're going to focus on treatment in the pre-myopic range, cycloplegia is crucial. Now, what's interesting, and a phenomenon that I don't think we understand at all well yet, is that when children go through this transition from mild hyperopia through pre-myopia to myopia, certain things change. The most obvious one is they develop much higher rates of myopic shift in refraction. If we look at the 7 to 8 year olds we've looked at in Guangzhou, a non-myopic child has myopic shifts of around 0.2 diopters per year. A myopic child of the same age has 7 times that, around about 1.4 diopter per year. The gap decreases with time, along with decreasing refractive plasticity, but it's still there even at the age of 15 to 16. Not only does that change, but retina, according to Frank Scheffel's latest work, retinas lose the ability to respond to defocused red or blue light. That means they can't respond to longitudinal or chromatic aberration, which is the most likely way the retina detects sign of defocus. There's also a marked simplification of central retinal processing as measured by ERG, and Henry Chan in Hong Kong has shown this very nicely. But we really don't understand what's going on in this change from hyperopia to myopia, and I think it will be an important area of research. How well do the treatments that we have in hand work on pre-myopes? Well, we know that time outdoors starts to lose its efficacy as refraction drops into the pre-myopia range and then into the myopic range. Once your myopic time outdoors is not very effective, although I think there is some efficacy based on seasonal variations. But other myopia control approaches work for myopes clearly. The only one that I think we know works for pre-myopia is atropine. So if we're thinking about using time outdoors, we should concentrate on children who are still in that hyperopic reserve. Now, the best time to do this is quite clearly in the preschool and early primary school years. It's the best time to prevent the onset of myopia by increasing time outdoors, because most children are still in that hyperopic state, and because delaying onset will have major effects on the final refractive state. So, okay, let's increase time outdoors, but what about decreasing educational pressures, in Sec Jin's words, with the view to myopia prevention by the avoidance of excessive near work? Just a mild diversion, is limiting internet or smartphone use the answer? Well, I think the answer to this is clearly no. The epidemic of myopia developed well before access to the internet became freely available, 92, 93, but it was even more clearly before smartphones became available, 2009, 2010. So it's logically impossible for them to have caused the epidemic of myopia. But it's also true that smartphone use, or the internet more generally, may have become an important part of modern near-work loads. But if we say to children, stop using them, go back to reading books, unless we change other things, they will still be myopic. Excessive near work or increased time outdoors will have to be implemented. Now, I want to make it very clear I'm not arguing against limiting smartphone use during childhood and adolescence. I've just finished reading this book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation. It makes a persuasive case that smartphones, and in particular social media, have led to marked increases in mental health problems, including suicides, and particularly for girls. It suggests that smartphones should be banned at school. I thoroughly agree. Some schools in Australia are now doing that, and the reports are very, very positive. It also argues that an enforceable minimum age of 16 should be set for access to social media sites. And once again, I completely agree, although I think there needs to be something about the power of the big companies that run the social media. But what people who argue against dealing with the education system are missing is that, in fact, Singapore and China are seeking to change their education systems because of concerns about education and broader social outcomes. Now, Singapore's been attempting to do this since 2000. There's a very good article by Kwek Ho and Wong, published by the Brookings Institution, which gives a lot of details on this. But the end result is probably not a lot of progress in changing parents' opinions. 30% certainly remained old school parents. 30% said they wanted both, which probably means when push comes to shove, academic results come first. 34% were in favour of holistic learning over academic achievements, but this was a questionnaire in which it was clear that the desired result was that. So I suspect it exaggerates the number of parents who are actually in that category. Now, every country in the East Asia region faces the same problem. Singer's approach has been highly cautious and has largely relied on asking parents to change, with no attempts to limit private supplementary tutorials. South Korea actually tried to ban them back in 2000, but this was ruled unconstitutional. About the same time, Japan introduced Yutori, or relaxed education. And although my observations of visiting Japanese schools suggest that schooling is somewhat more informal and more relaxed, there's been no observable impact on myopia. And most commentators think that's because parental attitudes haven't changed. Taiwan has inserted the aim of 2 hours per day outdoors into school programs by government decree, and this seems to be generating positive results, but has otherwise made little attempt at other educational reform. And then we have the famous elephant in the room, mainland China. China's policies on myopia go back a long time. They go back to 1962, when increases in the prevalence of myopia were noted. Anecdotally, the prevalence of myopia in senior high school in Beijing had reached 30%, and this was regarded as a crisis. So Chinese eye exercises were further developed and popularised. The only problem is they didn't work, or in the more cautious language that you would tend to use in mainland China, they were not sufficient to prevent the development of an epidemic of myopia. Things started to change in China in 2012 when a Beijing economist, Li Ling, demonstrated that limited access to refractive services, very typical in China at that stage, could cost the Chinese economy 1 to 3% of GDP, and that affects a government. This triggered an emphasis on the training of optometrists or refractionists, and this is still a work in progress. It also triggered some speculation about private practice in these areas, rather than concentrating it in ophthalmic hospitals, but there's been little progress in that area. In 2018, somewhat out of the blue, President Xi declared getting myopia under control a national priority. And since then, there's been a rapid development of national school screening programs based on visual acuity or non-cycloplegic refraction or some combination. But there are still problems linking this screening to clinical assessment and treatment. In Taiwan, it became compulsory. If you failed the visual acuity test, you had to come back to school with a letter from your ophthalmologist. I don't think China is yet thinking about that. There's some emphasis on increasing time outdoors. It's certainly got official recognition, but there's only limited school-based implementation so far. Now, there's been a systematic trend to education reform in China. The first attempts at reducing educational loads in preschool were made in 2013, very soon after Xi Jinping became president. There have been sporadic attempts to limit high-stakes education examinations, eliminate student rankings in the early years, and to decrease homework loads. But in 2021, the decision had obviously been made to take this sort of action very seriously. And China announced its double reductions policy, a policy designed to reduce burdens on students and their parents. They implemented strict controls over the private tutorial business, a billion-dollar business, insisted that they required them to become not-for-profit, and most of them closed down. In 2022, we saw a revision of the vocational education law, trying to give vocational education a status equivalent to academic education, because China has a shortage of well-qualified and well-trained tradespeople and technicians. Because parents who were addicted to the tutorial system tried to find ways around the effective banning of the private system, of course, you had the immediate appearance of small-scale tutoring. And in October 23, the government announced further restrictions to limit the places where small-scale tutoring could take place. This is clearly a very a complex response to complex social problems, such as a low birth rate, uh, dropout culture amongst adolescents and young students, mental health problems and suicide, shortage of workers with skilled vocational qualifications, context in the overall context of increasing youth unemployment, long working hours, and high costs of housing. You can only go so far in dealing with them within schools, but I think the directions being taken seem very positive. Now, I want to draw some parallels between what policies for myopia control and the double reduction policy. Kathy Rose and I spent some time thinking about the policy level educational risk factors for myopia, and I've been through them once before. I've listed them here. Competition for accelerated learning streams or schools, probably the core of the problem, leading to high homework loads at the start of schooling in preschool, and early use of PST classes, and limited time outdoors. I'll leave aside the issue of rote learning. China's double reduction policy addresses all of these areas. There's an emphasis on attendance at local schools with severe limitations on homework in preschool and early primary, and abolition of the commercial tutorial class industry, and a lot of emphasis on expanded time outdoors and expanded after-school care, which may be very important because it's a great time to get kids outdoors. I think what we're seeing is there are two silos. There's an ophthalmic silo and an education silo. Ophthalmologists, I think, are increasingly thinking about ways of preventing myopia and the possible changes that you could make in a school context to minimise the risk of myopia. Educationists, from a quite different perspective, are reaching similar conclusions about what should be changed. But a major problem is that these two areas do not interact much in China or Singapore, or indeed anywhere as far as I can tell. I can give you two examples. I was fortunate to be able to attend the first major national meeting after Xi Jinping identified myopia as a problem in 2018, a meeting aimed to bring together the education people and the ophthalmology people. It was a 2-day meeting, and by the second day, all but one of the education people had left. I've just recently read Singapore's 3 basic documents on early childhood education. Myopia is mentioned only once in one of them. One is entirely devoted to emphasis on play and play outdoors and its educational advantages, without a mention of myopia. I think we all agree effective myopia prevention must start in preschool and must be continued at least to the end of the primary school. And there's considerable overlap between what is required for myopia prevention and what I'll call modernisation of the education system. We have to remember that cultural change is a very slow process, and changing parental attitudes inevitably slow. But governments, through their control over schools, can control what happens in schools. And that's the best place to get the time outdoors that we need. There are strong arguments from both sectors through an increasing role for play, and particularly outdoor play. And I'd suggest that instead of working in our silos, we should try to work with educators to put this case to government, with a particular emphasis on the costs of not addressing these two issues. I'll finish with another book that I'd recommend. This is a book called Let the Children Play by a quite famous Finnish educator, international expert, Pasi Sahlberg. a very strong case on why children playing in the early years of schooling has an important educational function, including developing things like resilience. Pasi Sahlberg has just recently taken up the position of Professor of Education at Melbourne University. And I can tell you I'm trying to form some links so that we can start breaking down the silos, and hopefully you'll hear more about this in the next couple of years. And I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for a very informative and thought-provoking thought. Thank you very much for your talk. Any questions from anyone? George? George's the director of the Singapore Eye Research
Yep.
Institute.
No, Ian, thank you. That was good. It was a very interesting talk. It certainly provided a lot of historical context to everything in the past and where we're going in the field. So just on your last note there, you think that really to get the stakeholders getting things moving forward, we have to get the educational MOE departments on board with the whole program to really get some action done.
Oh, I think so. As I said, it's not just prevention of myopia. There is a very, very strong argument for loosening up early childhood education so that children have a lot more, they call it discovery-led learning. There are all sorts of educational terms, but it is very compatible with what I would argue we need to do within schools to prevent myopia. At the limit, you can, in one sense, what it seems to me China is trying to do, and I think this is a very smart move, they're trying to shift the educational pressures from the preschool, early primary school level up into the senior high school.
Yeah.
A very Western pattern. That's what you don't worry about things until you're getting close to that university entrance examination.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it would certainly make myopia prevention much, much easier.
Yeah. That's great.
Okay.
Any questions from anyone else? Any questions from anyone else? Ian, I've got a question for you about tuition centers and the role of education. Do you think that the time spent reading and writing that really increases a lot more if a child attends a tuition center?
Well, I think inevitably it does, because children are locked into school hours, whatever they are. And in fact, if you don't have it, the difference between children occurs in those outdoor time, well, out of school times committed to reading and writing. So tutorials. It reached the situation in South Korea, for example, where the supplementary tutorial business had become so strong that schools stopped setting homework because children were doing so much tutorial time. They didn't have time for their homework, and they came to school tired. Now, the South Korean government actually introduced time limits. They had to close by midnight. They had to set up a special division of the police to try and enforce that rule. And basically then their attempts to regulate that sector were ruled unconstitutional because it was an infringement of parents' rights. And they've given up entirely. It can get that bad. I think there's one. I'll throw in another provocative thought. I think the East Asian pattern has come out of it's essentially a Chinese cultural phenomenon. It comes out of the fact that needing to learn characters is a huge learning load that can essentially only be a rote learning load. And Chinese students complain of, the thousands of characters and the thousands of strokes that they have to learn. Uh, I think that's going to be a challenge for China because in easing the process of early school learning, but I can't see any foreseeable future in which China's going to abandon their very prized characters. So I think they're going to have to carefully balance load to make sure that they don't have a problem with written literacy. But I think they have no choice, and I think everywhere has no choice if they want to get on top of the myopia epidemic, but to start introducing these measures, more time outdoors, and freeing up the study load, which will help with more time outdoors in preschool and early primary school.
There's a question from Raymond.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Professor Morgan. A very quick question related to time outdoors. I mean, 2 hours is already a lot per day. Right now, we're advocating for more than 2 hours. Of course, this cannot be globed in one bout of 2 hours. So if you want to give an advice to parents, would you say that we should be optimizing or increasing time outdoors during school hours or more in the afternoon? So is there an impact of time of day on when are the children going outdoors?
I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. I think there are some indications from animal work and a little bit from human studies that maybe afternoon is a better time. That would fit very nicely with after school care in the Chinese context, but I don't think we really know the answer. The main thing I would say is that it's really, in terms of getting a rapid change on that matter, it's really something that has to be done within the schools rather than by asking parents to change. Parents are busy. Parents have got, a belief, they want success for their children. It's very hard to ask them to change rapidly. Like there are interesting discussions going on in China with some parents saying, well, we thought this was going to be fine because it was going to level the playing field. Nobody would have private tutorials. And then they find that very wealthy parents are employing nannies. They're not tutors, they happen to do the work of tutors, but they live in the house, etc., etc. So the concept of a level playing field disappears, and then popular sport becomes more nuanced. I think doing it through the school system has practical advantages. I think it will help enormously if you loosen up the education system, create more space for time outdoors. And if you want to push the argument a long way, you could say, okay, give us preschool and primary school. You can torture the kids as much as you like. Once they get to high school, they can learn 1,000 characters a day, do 3,000 maths problems. But if you could do that, you would make a really substantial impact on the prevalence of myopia.
Okay, may I follow up with one question, one additional question? Just, is there a role for time outdoors on the weekend to compensate for what's happening on the weekdays?
Yeah, I think so, but not completely. Yeah, I think what we know, if we go back to our basic biology, because going to be very hard to get an answer on that from children. But if we go back to our basic biology, we know that dopamine, for example, has a sort of roughly 24-hour cycle. It's light-driven, but has a circadian component. So if you can keep dopamine up a lot on the weekend, that gives you 2 days out of 7. That would have an impact, but we really need to have an impact on the other 5 days.
Thank you, Professor Morgan.
Ian, we're going to end soon. Thank you for a great talk. But just one more question for you. What are your thoughts on dopamine eye drops?
Well, I've been very close with that, yeah. It works spectacularly in animal models. In animal models, the levodopa drops work better than atropine. And I think it has a conceptual advantage because I think there's a very clear case that there's a central pathway involving photoreceptors, rod bipolar cells, and dopaminergic amacrine cells. That's an important part of the regulatory pathway. Wherever atropine acts, it appears to be off that central pathway. So it might be cleaner, but this is absolutely contingent on successful trials with children.
Thanks very much, Ian, for a wonderful talk. Thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you once again. Have a good day,
It's been my
everybody.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.